Ich hoffe, die kommen heute noch.
Ich bin gespannt, wie die beiden heute wieder zusammenpassen werden.
Das ist eine super spannende Mischung, die wir da heute beieinander haben und bin ganz gespannt, weil es wird großartig werden.
Was wird das, Boris?
Keine Ahnung. Okay. Wir können anfangen. So, once again, Nataša and Ivan, welcome in ERSTE Foundation and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
It's a big honor to have you here. We know that you have a lot to do and it's not self-understanding that you share your time with us. What we're doing is we are working on a new charter for ERSTE Foundation. And this special task that we are talking about is the role that ERSTE Foundation has as the main shareholder of ERSTE Group. We plan to provide orientation and to support a dynamic financial institute in a meaningful way. To this end, we have divided the Foundation's areas of activity into 7 fields, which is people, location, prosperity and resources, meaning and form, change, order, future intelligence. Today, we will be talking about location. And to talk about location, so we would want to start about just talking about where are you from and how did you make your way to where you have come? What's the place that you call home? So perhaps we can start with this, Nataša.
Yeah, no, this is supposed to be a simple question, but it's actually not. I'm honestly trying not to be too fixated on the idea of home, but to feel well wherever I am. But Zagreb is my home city. Even now, after quite a number of years, I don't really spend so much time there. But I spent my first few decades there, and I was always pretty aware that it's a form of privilege to be born in a city and grow up in a city and have your friends from kindergarten to university. And professionally, everything we are doing, and I'm saying we because I'm a member of curatorial collective, What, How and For Whom, with whom I'm working together for more than 20 years. Whatever we were doing in this period, and it was not necessarily in Zagreb, it was basically around Europe and in many other places out of Europe, we always took Zagreb as a kind of symptom and tried to translate it into, make it interesting or related to the places where we were working. And this worked because we started to work in the late 90s. This was the end of so-called, or towards the end of so-called transition. It was the period after the war. There was this idea of European Union as something that we are aspiring to collectively, I mean, as a society in Croatia. There was a lot of suppression of socialist history. There was not enough discussions on is the neoliberal capitalism the only way for humanity to evolve, to develop. And this is nothing specifically rooted only in Zagreb. So we always find a way to take some of these questions with us wherever we worked. And now for last almost 3 years, we work in Vienna in a very different institutional setting than the one where we were then in Zagreb. Like it's a public institution, fully supported, with some financial stability, or at least that's how it was until now, when basically nobody knows what's going to happen. But we are still trying to do the same thing. How do you build links, meaningful links to different communities? We do feel in some way very much at home in Vienna. There was, before we moved here, there was this cliché that Vienna is a capital or metropolis of our shared historical empire. But to what degree this is really true, I was not aware before I moved here. So in a way, Vienna is also
kind of home.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, yeah.
Can I start with the first question again with you, Ivan? Where's a place that you call home, and
It's not simply calling home. For me, Sofia is a home. Our historical capital, as you know, was not Vienna but Istanbul. And it's interesting because when I say that you're calling home, it's not that the place that you like most or you feel bad. It's three other things. First, home is the only place where you can see people from your past that you have never seen. You're going to see a classmate from kindergarten. And this kind of idea that you meet totally different people, that basically you don't know how you know them. This keeps you to keep all your life in its length. In the way your library is valuable to you, not because that you're going to read the books, but because you remember when you buy them, why you buy them. So from this point of view, home is this one. Secondly, home in my view is a place where you feel ashamed of. For example, if something really scandalous happening in Vienna, this does not give me sleepless nights.
for me?
Yeah, but if something, basically Bulgarians are going to do something idiotic, it's not me, but other Bulgarians, you feel ashamed of this. And in my view, and this is quite important. And the third thing, and you know, in English language, feel home and feel free are kind of meaning the same thing. Because feeling home means that you're behaving with other all the time, seeing your behavior with the eyes of others. This is what you're doing home. You are dressing kind of idiotically, or you're not dressing. And I do believe this is very important, and this is why for me Bulgaria is a home. It's also a generational difference in the way you're defining home. Because I was 25, 1990, I have not been traveling outside of the Eastern Bloc, and even the geography is different. For me, the West was Yugoslavia. No, but this is very important. The strongest impression in my life was in 1990, going by train from Sofia to Dubrovnik and stopping in Belgrade and then Dubrovnik. And why this was strange, of course London and Paris and so on were much more impressive, but you know first them from films, and secondly you never compare Sofia with London. So I'm saying this because in a certain way the idea of the home is very much also about the neighborhood. How to say, this geography changes all the time. In 1990, and this was on the eve of the war, moving from Sofia to Belgrade was like moving from a black and white movie to a color movie.
Wow.
And in 2000, no, but it was the fact. And not now, probably, if I'm going to see it back then, it was not impressive, but this is what you remember. And then in 2000, this was just after bombing and so on, I was back in Belgrade, and then you start to talk people, and they're telling me how impressed they were to come to Sofia. Because in a certain way, they saw Belgrade not changing, while Sofia changing. So this is why the idea of the home is, interestingly, people believe that home is the place where you can go back. No, the home is the place that you cannot leave, because you cannot go back. Because in a certain way, the place that you believe you go back does not exist anymore. But this is the place that you cannot leave, even when you are living in other places and talking about jokes. The famous joke in Bulgaria is that today Vienna is the best place to live in Bulgaria. For sure, you're going to see more. You're going to see much more Bulgarian on Maria Hilferstrasse than German. But this is an important, at least in my view, definition of home, and this is also goes to institutions, to people in a certain way. You have the urban population. If you're going to see the values, the preferences, including the political preferences of the big Central European cities, be Warsaw or Budapest, they're closer to Vienna than to their basically own countryside. And this urban-rural divide is the most important in Europe as a whole. You're going to see in many places. The generational divide is quite important, particularly when it comes to issues like gender and others. You cannot understand what is going on if you also don't see a generation of aging men who basically don't understand what is happening in the world, becoming very nervous, very aggressive, of losing the will of their own. So from this point of view, I do believe that we are slightly misinterpreting the starting point. And when you say the direction, normally, it's very rare in history that you know where you're going. Just for a very short period of time during the kind of a high modernism, the future was a project. And this was typical for communism. Normally, the future is either people see the future as the coming of the past, and this is one of the problems with Europe, because in 2019 there was a big public opinion poll that really depressed me more than many other things, in which you see that the majority of the people believe that the past was better, the life was better before. We don't know when before. For different people, before is a different place, but this type of a nostalgic majority which basically want to go past. And I was talking to, there is a very famous Bulgarian fiction writer, Georgi Gospodinov, who wrote a novel, and this was something that we have discussed back then. And the story was, in every country, you're going to have a referendum not about the future, but about the past. In which decade of the 20th century you want your society to go back? This is part of it.
And what is Bulgarian answer?
Bulgarian answer, he basically believed that it should be somewhere between the 1910 and 1980, this kind of excited nationalism of a type with nationalism with the socialist characteristics. But in my view, the interesting question is, imagine that in Europe we're going to have a referendum all over Europe. Which is the year in which we want to go back? And this year should be equally good for everybody. For the East, for the West, for the Poles, for the Germans, for the Austrians. And I was thinking a lot after we have talked a lot with him about this. And in my view, paradoxically, the only year that is going to fit is going to be 1989. Because everybody has kind of this horizon of expectations. Different political kind of groups. For people on the left, this was kind of the left at last divorced from the Soviet legacy. For the right, the end of socialism. For this and that. So from this point of view, the future is, in my view, should be seen much more as maximizing the horizons of possibilities than having simply the direction. Because when you have a direction, because history is not a train, in order you can have a final station. And when you have a direction, it's always going to be disappointment, because dissatisfaction is so normal to the way humans function. So from this point of view, we should be much more afraid if we try to see fear of the future. Not that we don't know exactly, we cannot agree what kind of a future we want.
You want to recur?
Yeah, no, you said so many things. I think when you started with this, that people also felt not seen, and that this imitation. I think there is also something in that we can agree on, that there was a position of kind of Europe is in the know, and there will be knowledge transfer to children, all of us, as Boris Buden calls it, all of us children. And this is condescending, this is patronizing. I think this disillusionment, because also we never became kind of fully neither economically but also not culturally part of Europe. There is still one Europe and the other Europe, and people start to feel it more. So there is really disappointment. I think I know what you speak about when you say who is we in the 90s and expectations. Yes, there was this, Croatia, which was really fully nationalist and right-wing, the road to European Union was kind of correction for total abuses of human rights and plundering of the country. But once we joined, which was in 2013, the joke was like, we came for the party after everybody left. This was already the kind of trickling down.
Yeah.
But I think it would be, for me, it would be important really that in conversation like this, and in a context like Vienna, and generally in so-called what used to be Western Europe, that there is really this condescending, patronizing, knowing all, without respect for whatever historical achievements of socialism under however dark communist regime was. It was just not recognized. I moved to Berlin. I spent last years in Berlin before I came here. It's really absolutely shocking to what degree Western Germany just doesn't acknowledge Eastern Germany, even after all these decades after the unification. And I think in a way this plays for all of East, West Europe.
And this is, by the way, particularly important for the Western institutions coming to Eastern Europe, talking about the foundation, talking about the banks. Listen, in 1990s, people were very much interested when the Western institutions come to understand how the West functions, how it lives. So you basically go and try to see, for example, if there is a Western foundations, what kind of projects you like. Or if it is a bank, how you're giving a credit. 10 years later, the question is, do you understand us? Because now you're becoming part of our society. And this is the normal idea of a foreigner, in a positive way. Foreigner comes, and in the beginning you're so much kind of interested to understand about his own world. But then the foreigner becomes important when it helps you to understand your own world by understanding you.
Can I interrupt you? Sorry. No. Can I interrupt you? Because I completely agree, Ivan. And it has always been a bit part of the strategy to say, let's build a local form of authority and not come in like some Americans. Sometimes I explain you what democracy is, right? Still, there is the moment of understanding, and then there is the moment of fighting for your cause. Because, and this is hard. Because if I say I have to understand the local colorit in a certain sense to say, okay, we have a different concept of democracy and it looks like this. And I say, wait a minute. But basically, this has nothing to do with democracy because we are part of a union, and we agreed 50 years ago to say that the European Union has a concept of values which is built on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now the question is how to...
listen, it's different because you basically believe that the local in Hungary is just Mr. Orban, and this is not true. Hungarian society has a different trends, and this is one thing to go and say, listen, who are the people to whom I feel closer? So you go for your allies and not simply basically of the idea that you're there to teach. Because the story is, one is to say, okay, it's very different. And this is what I do believe some of these political leaders on the right now try to capitalize, playing on the difference of Eastern Europe, of we're different, you don't understand us. Listen, I don't believe that we are very different, honestly speaking. No. I don't see this. By the way, the divide between the major capital cities and the other part of the country, I see in Austria as much as I see it in Bulgaria or in Hungary. But the story is totally different. You can go there, and of course there is a certain type of a liberal community that very much shares your values, but probably they have different priorities, they have a different idea what matters, they have a different language to speak about it. You're sharing values, but you're not sharing experience because they're coming from a different experience. And in my view, this is what I mean by local. It's not that you're going to buy the narrative of a kind of a illiberal government, and this is what it means to respect the tradition. But there is also a liberal tradition in Hungary which does not need to be the same like the liberal tradition in Germany.
The story?
No.
Okay, the story is beautiful. So suddenly, in Bratislava, they realized that the taste of Nutella that they're buying in the supermarkets in Bratislava is not as good.
Same concerns in Croatia.
And listen, and I was very much, of course, interested in this because when you talk to the Nutella people, they say, listen, we try to feel the local tastes. We did it not because Slovakia is the worst place, but because we believe that Slovaks prefer this and that level of sugar. So in a certain way, they went to get local. And they went local in a very wrong way, because in the eyes of the Slovaks, they were treated as a second-class citizens because there was kind of a cheaper ingredients that had been put in the Nutella. And I do believe, paradoxically, the most important about locality is this super sensitivity about patronizing. This is, strangely enough, what you get from the Nutella scandal is to understand that for the people, being treated as second-class citizens is critically important. And then you have two different ways. Listen, when you come, for example, if you're in Sofia and you come to Vienna functions better. The metro is better. It's much richer city, much kind of. And then you talk about corruption, and we know that we have something of it. Let's put it mildly, patriotically. Probably you have a lot of it too. But the other problem is, do you want to reduce the gap? Do you want slightly to do it better? Or try to normalize your own situation? And then the narrative says, listen, the Austrians are as corrupt as us, but they're better covering.
I kind of agree, but yeah.
Exactly. No, but this is the problem. And it is not so, this is not so kind of scandalous, because in a many way, do you know where is the difference? The difference is basically how in your local discourse first you decide what is corruption. Secondly, how tolerable or intolerable societies are. And this is very, very important. And this is what I find, finding your place in a society does not mean agreeing with what basically they're doing.
But you used the expression patronizing sometimes before. So do you still feel that Western Europe is patronizing the European East and South?
Yeah, I think that's something that's very hard to shed. Yes, I do. I don't know if I would necessarily call it patronizing, but that there is this idea that, that Poland and Hungary have this political situation or that Eastern Germany has more of neo-Nazis because there is no democratic tradition. They just didn't learn the lessons of democratization good enough. And I just somehow, it's not that I necessarily have better explanation, but this one doesn't sound convincing to me. It's not. There must be some other trajectories, some other red threads that are just not visible enough.
For instance?
Yeah. No, I don't know. I know that, what was very important for us when we worked, coming out of Yugoslav wars, there was always this idea that what's going on in Yugoslavia is a symptom of Europe also, and that Europe is divided and split within itself. And I think the way how Europe and the promising 90s that me and my people unfortunately spent in the war, but I would say that this was kind of optimistic and the most fun decade in recent European history. I think these promises were betrayed. These are the years in which a lot of the social benefits were either cancelled or made almost criminalized or made very difficult to get, where the idea of social solidarity collapsed. So Europe also showed its own hypocrisy and its own double standards, and I think that we are really seeing this now. With the Ukrainian refugees and other refugees and the outpour of solidarity. I can't see this outside of this context of inner European hypocrisy and of the European Union institutions that really didn't make themselves friendly to people. There is all this bureaucratic attempt to make it transparent and fair that trickles down everywhere, but in the end you lose the essence. There is no passion about European Union constitution or things that governed our daily lives. We all remember the elections with low output and So I don't know how to get rid of this patronizing. I think it's almost impossible. What
do you think?
And it was by invitation. But I very much agree. I do believe the only thing that we should be also fair to ourselves is that part of this patronizing initially was very much on invitation. Because one of the stories basically to tell what happened in the last 30 years is not to talk about the transition, but to talk about migration. In a certain way, East migrated to the West, and in two different ways. Individually, like us being here, and then basically collectively with the countries through the process of European integration and so on. So what you're seeing in many of these places, including Hungary and Poland, that for obvious reason I don't have particular sympathy for the governments, both governments, is that this is a classical crisis of the second generation of migrant. The first generation comes, and they're very much kind of fascinated by the new opportunities you try to integrate and so on. There is a lot of study in sociology. Most of the kind of a radicalism, it was a lot of done in Britain because of the Islamic radicalism and so on, comes during the second generation in which you're already born here. In a certain way, many of the people who are voting for these parties and so on are young people, particularly in Poland. And then they have the feeling that there is a glass ceiling, that they cannot achieve it, that they're never going to be totally accepted, that they're going to be treated differently. And this is becoming weaponized, and this is becoming kind of aggressive assertion. And this is the interesting story, and this Yugoslav experience in my view is also great, because now with the war in Ukraine, you're all the time comparing. We're comparing atrocities, we're comparing here and there. The interesting story was that during the Yugoslav wars, what discursively we all achieved is to claim that this is something coming from the past, that this is totally isolated case, that this is because of the Balkans, that this is because of many things.
Ancient
hatreds. Interestingly, imagine the following. Imagine two political scientists. One being in 1990s in Belgrade, and he does not have a clue what was happening in Prague or Budapest or Warsaw. And the other being in Prague and didn't have a clue that there was a war in Yugoslavia. And now ask these two to come and make a report about the future of Europe. And you're going to be surprised that those who was in Belgrade is going to give probably a more realistic explanation about some of the problems that we are facing, because some of the problems that we are seeing now and that were perceived as specifically Yugoslav and so on turn out to be European problems. And I do believe the biggest challenge for me about Europe is not simply how to have a common values, but how to try to come with a common experience. And experience is a different type of a category. This means that you are first starting to be interested in others. You're trying to understand in what you're in a way the same and different. And this kind of a universalist claim.
But then the one question I still, even for you, is that you always pronounce kind of, don't forget the demographic facts if you talk about the future of these countries we are talking about, right? And I would love to discuss this a bit, because we see it too. Maybe, that's the strange stories about history, that now there's lots of migration from the Ukraine, so maybe this issue we will see from a different perspective now. But this has always been part of the story, that these countries lose basically their educated elite, right?
The liberals.
On the one side. On the other side, basically, we visited Eastern Slovakia once, and we saw that we saw cities and villages where basically all women were working as care people in one of the Western society countries, and they had a huge issue locally because they even could not staff their local homes for poor people or for elderly people, etc., etc. So, but where are we heading? Because, do we need something? Do we need a new idea? I just read also reports that now, basically, there's a huge struggle in the Visegrad community, as you read too, because the Polish and the Czechs don't at all understand Viktor Orban and his closeness to Russia. What must happen? Who must sit on the table, and how can we organize such a space or such a format where we can negotiate the nearby future in a form that we don't step into the traps you just mentioned with the patronizing or whatever. what's the public field we have to open in order to be able to move a step forward?
But listen, we paradoxically started because the only public field for normal discussion is crisis. Before the crisis started,
nothing was possible.
Nobody noticed that Eastern Europe was totally depopulated. Listen, this is a big issue. You have dying villages. When villages starts to die, the infrastructure starts to die. Mm-hmm. When there is kind of older people, the hospitals stop to be there. And as a result of it, what you are seeing is you don't understand why people who, when you ask what is the best thing that happened to you after 1989, and all of them said in every single country that the most important was opening of the borders, because it's true. Individually, you're getting the possibility to do things that otherwise you will never do. But on the other side, why the same people basically are so scared about the opening of the borders? And now you suddenly realize that part of it is that for certain people, what is opening of the borders? Yes, their kids are in Vienna, but it also means that probably they're not going to share language with their grandchildren. So particularly for the older generation, this is an issue. And then all these people talking about ethnicity, and then comes the Ukraine war, and these same Poles that were against getting 1,000 Syrians are getting 2 million people at their houses, because the difference with Austria is that most of the people who are now in Poland are living in the houses of the Poles. They're taking and doing this. Is there kind of a cultural similarity issue? For sure. So probably I'm kind of lacking the visionary stuff, but I'm afraid that Europe was producing too many visions, which goes as a plans, and coming from where I'm coming, I have seen a lot of plans in my life. People are seriously negotiating only when it goes of making the choices that touches them directly. Where, for example, we now have two different kind of instincts. One is what we're seeing in Ukraine is totally unacceptable. And on the other, the perspective of basically getting rationing of the energy and electricity cuts and so on, for us is also unacceptable because this is not our normality. But if you want to do this or that, you should make a choice. And even I'm not saying in what kind of direction you'll go, but you believe that you are not going to make a choice. Mm-hmm. It's not going to happen. And in my view, these choices is where you're discussing, and you're discussing seriously, and people are going to be divided, and they're going to be the peace party, and they're going to be the justice parties, and we're going to... But this is the real story.
Mm-hmm. So this is the common European experience that you make?
Yeah, we have a common European experience, and this common European experience was always the experience of crisis, much more than the experience of normality.
Mm. You don't look happy.
Not very much, is it? True, I'm sorry. It's, I think having to talk about Europe, it's also, of course, Europe is our place. But I think for different reasons, we should stop being, Europe doesn't set the tone of the conversation anymore, and we should happily accept it. Mm-hmm. Maybe not in geopolitical, this I'm totally not an expert or anything, but when you say who should think, who should sit for these conversations, who are the people who should enact it, I think we are confronted now with the kind of repatriarchalization and with military patriarchy. Whenever war comes, this is one of the outcome. So I think without like a radical feminist vision, none of this conversation have much sense. And I really believe that that what generations, younger generations of both women and men and trans people and other people are doing really brings something new. And this I really also see connected completely with European colonial history, which was also never properly addressed or never willingly, only as a kind of response to a pressure or a crisis. Mm-hmm. And this I also see as a kind of crucially connected with European racism, in which we excelled historically over the centuries, and it's really time to reckon with this. And I see this racism stratified. There is racism and racism and racism, but I think the table without addressing feminism, racism and colonialism is kind of staying in a Europe in itself, Europe that is losing momentum, Europe that is losing vision, Europe which is in a kind of perma-crisis like the rest of the world. So,
yeah. You know, okay, Ivan.
No, because I do believe it's very important, but it is also interesting to see that here you're going to see some of the major differences in Europe. European societies came from two totally different histories. European Union was created by failing empires, or at least ex-empires.
Europe, you're more than your myth, huh?
Yeah.
May I just say one more thing? I just want to say about looking at colonialism. It's not, as I tried to say before, it's not about being obsessed with history. It's about looking at capitalism and the roots of capitalism and questioning capitalism. And this is something that is really, since the fall of the communist regimes, and there is no big threat of communism, really kind of fell out of question. We are trying to reform it, to make it better, and I am interested in imagining absolutely world without capitalism, totally. So yes, idea of revolution, idea of total change, these are the concepts that still inspire
But this is
me.
also important to keep the other legacies, because now it's easier, and I understand very well, and I do believe part of the totally uncritical reflections, capitalism as the natural state of society. On the other side, the idea that you can totally divorce the current kind of revolutionary expectations from the kind of legacies of a certain type of revolutionary experience is not something that I will do too. Because there are many things that you can see, for example, even on the level of language and so on, which for anybody of us coming from a certain historical context remind you of things that you remember. And this is what is interesting about legacies. This is not one legacy, there is not one experience. And this is where art matters, because art, it's not simply provocation, it's about nuances, it's about experiences. You're allowing people basically to articulate very powerfully words differently. Politicians are in search of words. And this is so amazing to see that basically they're much more in search of words than in search of money. And as a result of the last two crises, the state is coming back in a big way, but they're two different states. With the COVID, basically the welfare state come back to a certain extent because you should take care of the people. But then with the war comes the national security state. And this is also something that is... Yeah, absolutely.
So let's create a factory of wars.
No,
I don't know.
But does war mean that there is a reset of European values at the moment? Because it seems so. Because
it doesn't seem so to me. No, I think that's a rhetoric, but I don't feel
we'll know
it.
this, to be honest, in 6 months, because at the moment you have a momentum which is very much driven by the public's outrage of what they see there. But in a certain way, are the societies ready to pay the price for certain choices? This is the story. In a certain way, it's easy to say that we don't agree with what we see or we support Ukrainians, but how much you're ready to pay, what it means, because it's going to change societies, by the way. This is not simply... One of the things that people are not looking around is talking about the return of the state.
But what is the Europe that you say that you have, you asked if there is this idea that Europe is kind of consolidating itself ideologically and emotionally even in the face of this war. But what is this Europe for which we are supposed to sacrifice? So far it's not our lives, but let's say quality of lives. Europe that allows people to die and be beaten daily on Bosnian border, just around the corner here, over the years. Europe that doesn't let in, or Ukraine who doesn't let out African students in Ukraine. I mean, these are the things that I think we should be really shouting, and this I think are the things that could be inspiring for people, because this wave of solidarity that we are witnessing now with Ukraine, I wouldn't be surprised that it ends up like a wave of solidarity in 2015 with Syrian refugees.
Only one positive. The distinction, in a certain way, and I agree, in a certain way, this is a much more self-defensive identity that Europe, but in a certain way you have against you, not simply a country that started a war, but you saw three things that are so trivial about what we saw in Russia, that in a certain way it's kind of back to the basics. For example, that totally unaccountable power of one person can make anything
Unlike
possible.
Saudi Arabia.
No, but basically, paradoxically, because in the monarchical system, this idea of succession, but you have a man And you don't know. And it's not about who is the man, but after 20 years you can do everything. Secondly, the level, what we're not talking about, the internal repression now in Russia is striking. Listen, Russian society, we're not talking what is happening to them. Saying no to war is not the same as toppling the government. And being sent to prison for 15 years, I mean, with a new legislation, is something that is shocking. These Europeans are saying, I don't want to be like this, but I agree with you that we don't know exactly what we want to be. We're just scared. We're scared because we saw that our world, which we were taking for granted,
but how can we find out what we want to be?
And you know, yes. First of all, what's the way forward? And the second thing is, but still, then even we are always kind of in a defensive mode. What I really fight against, or in my emotions, that yes, what we talked before about universalism and etc., but I feel myself, and this is the big difference than I felt as we founded this institution, is I found myself fighting with many on the cause we kind of agreed on. Even if it was agreement which was maybe an unstable agreement. Can we have something
more optimistic?
Moving forward? Listen, where is the we're now, you know, the deconstruction guys here. Batch. But is there something, you know, you personally, Ivan, you know, you have children, or
I have a cat.
You have a cat, right? So. What world are we opening, right? Or
but maybe, Boris, we are not opening the world.
Yeah,
maybe
we all have a responsibility. We all have a responsibility.
Of course, let's responsibly not.
And I have energy and responsibility. We all have energy. Where do we put it into?
Climate change, of course. I mean, and imagine if that would be a criteria, so that you think about the raise of military budget, that you think about gas. I mean, what will this war do to climate change? We could go really back, so not only atomic threat, not only dictatorial threat, but also really stop on everything that was done towards tackling climate change in a sustainable way. This is an idea that obviously mobilizes young people.
In some countries.
In some countries.
Let's give it
like in the Western world.
Yeah. So climate is a Western issue.
Which we talked about it all the time.
Yeah, but exactly. In a certain way, paradoxically, the climate change is the last version of the Western exceptionalism. And I agree very...
I thought it's positive.
No, but it's not... No, I'm going to tell you positive, because you want to have a positive in the way you remember positive. And you said about our kids. Listen, one of the story of our kids is that they have a sensitivity different than ours. And one of our responsibility to our kids is to try to show the world in its complexity, and not simply basically to tell them, you have a cause here and there, and they're going to make their hard choices. We, by the way, cannot do it for them. We should simply empower them. And one of the things that you empower them is not simply with money, but also with knowledge, with the experience, trying to push them. Because, and this is what, for example, what I don't like, for example, about the current world is every 3 months, we're morally outraged about something. And then, do you remember how morally outraged people have been about the destruction of Aleppo? Have you heard recently anybody talking anything about Aleppo out of the Syrians who are coming from there? Then, after 3 months in Ukraine, somebody else is going to attack something else, and we're going kind of from outrage to outraged. And in my view is, let's look around our society, and by the way, looking from the perspective of our kids, and starting, by the way, a serious discussion with them. They don't necessarily going to fit to what we believe is important and not. And this is not particularly, you're getting also more pessimistic than they should be. Listen, have you read, any of you, just after 1990, the first 2 years, between 1990 and 1992, the major books that have been bestsellers and publications and so on, all of them were not optimistic books. And even I'm talking from the side of the very kind of a classical Cold Warriors. Title of a Brzezinski's book, Out of Control, Chaos.
I didn't read it.
Yeah, no, but listen, it's important. By the way, Entzerberger's, in my view, one of the best book on civil war. He had this very important book on civil war. So everybody remembers Fukuyama's book, but Fukuyama's book was kind of not necessarily the only book there. People there also were very much afraid because certain order has been collapsing that you knew, and something new was coming. And then I do believe this is where we should be. Our problem is that 1990s is what have shaped us. And even as institutions, by the way, this is going to be very true also, not only for foundations. And we're in a different world. And in my view, what you should fund, curiosity. For me, the biggest problem of Europe is that we're losing curiosity. Curiosity towards the world, curiosity towards our own societies. We believe that we know. We don't have a clue what is going on. Listen, the very fact that this same guy won the biggest majority in Hungary ever. He had more votes than in 2010, when he was an opposition party of a kind of a very corrupt government. And we till yesterday expected that he's going to lose elections. Shows you that we're getting something wrong. And investing in understanding what is going on in the heads of the people is how you're helping your kids, and not just giving them kind of dreams, because people don't borrow dreams. In a certain way, people have dreams of their own. They could be different, but people have dreams of their own.
I'm sorry to hear that you feel depressed. But
no,
I
just want to put it on the table too.
Yeah, no,
you
but
know,
I
to
think part
where's the challenge, right?
But part of it is really kind of giving up. This idea that man will save the world. This idea that
listen, even the women are not going to save the world.
But this idea that it sheds away together with the idea of progress, together with the idea of growth. Let's lean in, as they say, and yeah.
Listen, in a certain way, this was the reason I always had a great respect and sympathy for ERSTE. If you're going to ask me what is the distinction of the foundation is, asking this type of questions, because normally people are not asking. People don't get depressed for the right reasons. You're going depressed for right reasons because basically you don't know how to do what you can do for this. But because if you're doing this, we have even these conversations in which you're depressed. We are not agreeing on this and that. But what it means that the world has changed, everybody is saying this, what it means for us. If the world has changed, how it is changing for the ERSTE Foundation? How, by the way, it's changing for the ERSTE Bank? And then you start to be curious because you start to ask totally different questions. And if these questions are not asked, we're going to be shocked every 15 minutes, but what is happening?
I think this is exactly why we sit here, right?
Yeah,
this is exactly why we sit here.
This is where you're good at. I do believe that ERSTE Foundation was.
This is exactly why we sit here.
Yeah, and listen. It is unpleasant to lose power. Can you imagine how basically is the conversation among the opposition parties in Hungary after yesterday's elections?
Can I? But even to get you there, right? And maybe now I'm a bit nostalgic, right? If I read the lines in between the people in 1819 who sat here in Vienna and who said, let's create this kind of Sparkasse, and and you read it, then you read in every little sentence this fresh thought of enlightenment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Everybody's equal, and we have it there, right? And it's still it's very amazing. And this is a question we too have now is, if we sit here and if we rewrite it, because we have to create a new language, because we have to hand it over to a generation,
has
right?
changed
We have to reformulate that, because now you pronounce these things differently. It's the words, right? You were talking about. So how to create this context where we say it can be as radical as it was at that time. We can reformulate this again, or we can come and maybe formulate something different as radical as they did it at that time. This person who was basically the son of a rabbi, Mr. Aeschylus, who I thought, being in this discussion about Jewishness in the beginning of the 19th century, having this saloon where the intellectuals met, and on the other side, the Michelando, the Catholic priest with his solidarity and social heart, right? We have to do something because there are more and more poor people in the city. So this is why we are now creating. Now we need a positive. I don't want to call it manifesto or something, but where is the sentence or the words to say, out of this context, we now try to properly understand we can be as radical as it was in the beginning, just to talk to those basic human needs which have to be catered to in order to fulfill a positive mission. Because if you use the words as you completely say, what we do now is we use words from the 80s and 90s to pronounce this. And if I read my own mission, I'm lost, because exactly what you said, those words lost kind of their meaning. But how does this fabric of words work in order to be relevant again in the mission we would like to bring down on the floor?
Okay, but let's. And I'm sure that Nataša has more important to say for a very specific reason, because the idea of radical, the idea of new, the idea that basically you're coming with a manifesto, is also part of a world in which people were reading and not watching. We are probably going to. We cannot repeat the previous success. Listen, there is something, the only thing that I know from political science is the following. Normally, countries, leaders, and so on, became the victim not of their failures, but of their successes. Because in a normal moment of crisis, you're trying to repeat what worked the previous time. And for me, this is the most important thing. And this is empirically, I know. Why? I do believe from this point of view, you're starting with the idea to write a manifesto. I can put money that you're not going to end up with writing a manifesto.
No.
You are starting with something, and then you're going to end up with something totally different.
We have prepared a funny question for everybody. If
I don't know if this. Do you think we should pose it now? Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's the only chance for a last question. So, if for some odd reason you inherited a bank, what would you do with it?
Give it to Boris. No, I would give it away. That's for sure. Yeah,
You?
I'm going to sell it. No, because listen, but it's a good question, because in a certain way, inheriting a bank now is basically inheriting all the problems that we're talking about, but on a higher level. Tell me what is going to be the future of the banks in the next 10, 20, 30 years. So from this point of view, when you inherit something that you don't know what to do with it, better sell, and then what we're going to do is the money we're going to discuss on the next meeting.
Okay.
That's a good one.
Okay.
Hey, thank you.
That's it.
Thank you,
Thank
Nataša.
you very much.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed it.
Very much.
As we enjoyed it, thank you very much.
I can't imagine that it will be useful, but
With a bit of the continuity, the curiosity, the fabric of words, so the fabric, the production of words. I really believe that it's a lot about language and the language you choose. And because I myself make the experience that what I see and what I read from myself, or what we see as an institution, what we communicate and how we pronounce ourselves and identify ourselves, smells from an age which is not existing anymore.
Yeah, because it's a book. I have a friend who is very famous cameraman, and he was seeing the refugee exodus from Ukraine, and he told me things that stayed with me. I'm telling the story to you. He said, listen, there is only one thing that is new. He said, destroying cities, killing people, this everywhere we see. This was the first exodus where people were living with their pets.
yeah, that's true. That's true.
And he said this has an incredible impact on the reaction, because he said paradoxically pets humanize.
Yeah, that's like why poor people have dogs.
So from this point of view, he said people who are watching on television, the Ukrainian woman living, and seeing them basically getting them with their cat or dog, three narratives that was so popular during the previous crisis does not make any sense. First, you're not going to call them labor migrants. Secondly, obviously, these people were just coming from their houses. They had been expelled from the war. They were not planning and so on. But thirdly, the vulnerability. They take care of their pets because they cannot take care of themselves. And I do believe this type of a small insight is telling you more. I always believe in insights. Right. I don't believe in a big theory, honestly to speak. And from this, Hirschman is somebody which is really great on this. Get a small insight, and then why people are reacting so differently on this and that, and then you can understand something about the world.
Yes. great. I think we had some small insights here, and we will have some small insights in the conversations to come.
Absolutely.
And we're happy then to get back to you after we have finalized all the colloquiums, because I think we're going to touch some major other issues too. But for the time being, this was the first one. Very happy that kind of you played the pilot project here together with us, and you took your time. We're very thankful.
Shared a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
We cannot raise your spirit, but I know how you can raise the spirit of the bank. Raise the interest rate.